expands. So right now, not a ton of access. They're building more stuff there to put more things there in a mixture of uses, and in the long term, they're going to improve and expand in order to give even more access to opportunity. These are the same basic problem. You can't fit too many big things into a small container. This is not a technology problem. Do cars always offer us freedom? People will argue, well, cars are freedom. Cars are the things that give us freedom. Well, they can give a lot of people certain amounts of freedom, but do they efficiently provide everyone everywhere with freedom? And can you use them without obstructing someone else's freedom? That is really only true at very low densities in rural areas, where there's so much space, you really are never going to fill it up because of how low density is. When you're talking about places like Arlington, and when you're talking about the suburbs of most everywhere between Richmond and DC, it very quickly becomes no. Because at very high density, there's just far too little space. I live in Arlington. There's just far too little space for everyone to drive. It would be physically impossible. But in Loudoun, Prince William, Stafford, lots of places in between Richmond and DC, we just have such significant, vast horizontal growth that requires such long trips that if everyone drives, we very quickly achieve this problem. And road widening is not going to solve that problem. Road widening, number one, is going to create the giant problem of it's inordinately expensive because we very quickly, the land becomes too valuable. And secondarily, even if you do expand, you very quickly run into the induced demand of people drive more and more development comes and fills in that space. And induced demand is actually just a very simple way of stating what is a very clear biological principle. You know, biology, if you study it, you know, if you make it easier for an organism to do something that is helping it sustain its life, it will do it more. It will do that thing more. And if we make it easier to move around by car, more people will do it. So what typically goes wrong, and was challenged a lot of growing communities like yours, is the community grows gradually from rural to urban. People's awareness of these geometric facts lags behind the reality of what's happening on the ground. Because when you're a small town and mostly rural, it seems like you're never going to run out of that space. There's never going to be a significant problem. So planning and development and design are all based on the reality of that situation. And you quickly, however, exceed that capacity. The community starts to become urban and suburban, space becomes very scarce, and cars cease to really be an instrument for freedom for everyone. And if you do it too long, too much in that direction, it becomes very, very challenging to retrofit for transit and alternatives. So quickly, what is the freedom recipe? Which is also, incidentally, the recipe to maximize how many people use transit. The freedom recipe comes from how much transit service you have and how you put it out there, and how it interacts with the land use that you have and the land use that you can build. Frequency, favorable development patterns, reasonable speed and reliability, and a connected network. I'm going to skip over speed and reliability today because we only have so much time. But it's a pretty obvious thing. You got to be not getting stuck in traffic all the time if you're on transit. Frequency. Frequency is a cubed value. Frequency, how long you have to wait before the bus shows up. And we say frequency has a cubed value because the more frequent a transit service is, if it's coming every 20 minutes, 30, every 15 minutes, every 10 minutes, you don't have to think about when the bus is going to show up. You can just step out to the bus stop, they'll be coming soon. Secondly, when you have multiple routes that are frequent, that cross each other, you have extremely easy connections, which means you can reach not just what's on the route that you're on, but lots of other routes, because that frequency means you have very short waits and connections. You can get to lots of places in 2 dimensions, not just one. And then third, it's an immediate backstop for disruption. If the bus that happens to be coming up to your stop breaks down, if you're on a route that's coming every 10 minutes, okay, there's one not too far behind it. Frequency is extremely hard to explain for people who spend most of their day driving, because you never experience this problem of you cannot go until the vehicle arrives. If you're in an old building, you press the elevator button, and you wait for 45 seconds, you probably feel like your life is going to end because you're waiting so long, 45 seconds. If you're stuck behind a traffic signal on Route 3, which are like 3 minutes long sometimes, you feel like the world is going to end over 3 minutes. Think about a gate at the end of your driveway that only opens once an hour. That's the experience of living on a bus route that only comes once an hour. So if that bus shows up at 6 a.m., 7 a.m., and in order to be at your job to clock in, that you've got to be on that bus that leaves at 7 a.m., well, you better be out there. In this analogy, you better be in your car with your coffee for that gate to open, probably 5 minutes early, in case the operator shows up early, right? That is the challenge. And in your region, a lot of your services that you have are mostly every hour, or at best sometimes every half hour. That's a lot of waiting. Secondly, following a favorable development pattern. Another way of thinking about this is, where do alternatives to the car succeed the most on expanding liberty and opportunity and getting the most people to use them? When we put high-frequency useful transit in dense places, naturally there are more people around every potential stop. More people are benefiting from the useful service we're providing, and more people will therefore be likely to use it. Very simple geometry. Not making any moral statements about whether it is good or bad to live in that type of community. I'm simply stating a geometric reality. Walkability. If you imagine these two examples, here you have a bus stop in a place sort of like downtown Fredericksburg. Lots of gridded streets. There's a stop there, and I draw a circle that's a quarter-mile radius. Those bolded streets, those darkened streets, are ones you can actually reach in a quarter-mile walk, or about 5 minutes of walking. The pure geometry of that is the area of the diamond that gets made from that grid is about 66% of the area of the circle. Down here, you have an example in a typical cul-de-sac community. That much, much smaller area that's actually walkable from a stop, maybe only 40% of the circle size. If these two areas have the same exact overall density level, far, far more people and activities actually reachable from every stop. The other thing you have to be able to do is you have to be able to cross the street. If you have bus stops all along Route 3 for people to try to go to a lot of the shops and stores, can they actually cross the street? Because if they can't cross the street, they can go to the grocery store, but they can't get home, right? Third, perhaps most important, is linearity. So many communities we see building out today are built out not in the upper form. The upper form is a form where you have a bunch of streets where most of the activity is actually close to the street you can run transit on. Alternatively, you see in a lot of suburban communities the pattern of the office complex a half a mile back from the road on a secondary street. That's a cul-de-sac. You have the Walmart that's behind a half a mile of parking lots. You have the university that's put itself on a hill far up the street with all of its campus activities that are too far to really walk from the main road, or the community college campus in some cases. In all these cases, for you to actually get the bus up and into those destinations and back out adds a lot more time, which means anyone who's riding through now, it's a lot less convenient for them. And importantly, that's more time than paying the driver to go out of their way. And so it's more costly, it's less useful, a lot fewer people find it useful, and a lot fewer people use it. So a quick example, we're running out of time real fast. These are two areas in the west end of Richmond, if you're familiar with the area. Broad Street, Willow Lawn, the south. This is Libby Mill, and this is an old office building, used to be for Anthem. It's actually going to be redeveloped soon. Here you have a place that's trying to be built dense, walkable, most of its density, highest density, up on the main road, so that it's putting that activity where your transit can be linear long term. Here you have a giant office building. It's somewhat linear, it's incredibly dense, it's very not walkable. This can adapt to a transit and bike ped future. Today, there's not a lot of transit on this street. There will be in the future with more investment, and most importantly, it's physically possible to do so long term. Here, this in its current state is a permanent generator of intense traffic. So you can kind of think of this as, this is the vulnerable thing to build. This is the resilient thing to build. So, a couple of key things I want particularly people to think about in a growing region that's been very suburban in orientation over the long term. If it's dense, it should be walkable and linear. That is critical as you're thinking about new development. Don't build density more than 400 feet back from a street that can be transit oriented. If it's that far back, then transit will have to move off of the main street, and it will be much more expensive in the long term. The street can be made walkable later, but the development pattern is much, much harder to change. At all densities, try to mix your uses and income levels in order to keep trip distances down. This is critical. Closely mixing residential jobs and shopping significantly increases the likelihood that you can internally capture trips, and it just creates much more intense and significant destinations that transit can successfully serve, because the most productive transit corridors are ones that are not just very dense residential on one end and very dense commercial on the other, but are a mixture along the way, and have people coming from all of those nodes. And as you're building suburbs, even in subdivisions where you're making cul-de-sacs, build the potential for pedestrians and bikes to get out of those cul-de-sacs in the most linear way possible to the main roads that are transit accessible. So if you're building townhomes on cul-de-sacs that back onto the main road, build in that connectivity so that long-term the folks that live on this cul-de-sac don't have to take a half-a-mile walk to get to the bus stop, but can take like a 500-foot walk to get to a future bus stop. Lastly, I want to just mention forming a connected network is critical. If you don't have a connected network in transit, you can only move in one dimension. And the grid the frequent grid is a fundamental, enormous builder of freedom in a lot of communities, because you can make almost any trip in an L-shaped pattern. Leave A to get to B, you walk to a main road, you have a quick frequent connection there at the next street to connect to your second route, and you get to B with a short walk. Obviously, a lot of your community is not fully built out in a simple grid like Chicago or LA or others. But that doesn't mean you can't think about creating more of an overall connected grid of streets. And again, I'll point back to the Richmond area just because I have a lot of experience working there. This is the west end of Henrico, just a very simple Google Map screenshot of kind of the area from Gaskins, Glenside Road out to the far west end of Henrico. One of the things you'll notice, I just drew the basic structure of all of the kind of major connected streets in this area. One of the things that you'll notice if you spend much time in Henrico compared to a lot of other suburban communities is they did build a fairly substantial grid of every mile to half mile connected streets across a lot of the fabric of the county. You contrast that, so that's the basic street grid, you contrast that with a similar west end of the Chesterfield County just on the other side of the river. This is approximately a similar area of approximately similar density overall. But when you start to draw out the overall street grid pattern, it's far less dense and connected. So you compare those two, this is going to concentrate traffic in the short term. Everyone has to go to just these few main streets. And if you eventually do build out a transit network on here, far more people are too far a walk from any potential transit through street versus that other network, even in a suburban community. Lastly, I'll just close on a couple of notes about what do I see looking big picture, what you have in your current situation. Your current transit network is limited in frequency and span of service. You can solve that, even in the short term, with more investment. It needs operating dollars, it needs annual operating dollars to make it happen, but that's solvable. You can expand with more funding. You have a significant challenge of walkability in suburban job centers that you have today. That will take a lot of time to retrofit and improve. You also have a significant challenge of longer distances between destinations and relatively scattered density of pockets of apartments scattered about your community. That can be solved, but again, it's going to take long-term infill to help build really robust land uses that are transit supportive over the long term. Lastly, I want to close with the fact that there is not any alternative. We've got to find ways to make it possible to have enough space for everyone to be free. It may not be now, but it can be for our children and for our grandchildren. And so I hope you will remember that technology can't change this. You can't fit elephants in wine glasses, and that you think about how we build transportation for freedom. So thank you. Stuart.
Thank you, Scudder. Oh, we have a timer here. That's what you're looking at. You had your own timer going. All right. Well, you just heard from the professor of transit here. What I'm going to say is going to be complimentary. We have pretty pictures to go with it. There's going to be some overlap, but it's, I think, going to be very reinforcing, and hopefully also bring together for you that land use, transit, affordable housing connection that will help, tie the day together. Again, I'm Stuart Schwartz. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition for Smarter Growth in the DC area. We were founded 27 years ago by conservation groups, but our partnerships have expanded. What happened? But we've made partnerships with all sorts of affordable housing groups and advocates, transit advocates, bike ped advocates, and the business community and development community. It's our Blueprint for a Better Region. It was first issued in 2002, and in the last year we have updated both a PowerPoint version of it. I'll also show you pieces of that PowerPoint today, as well as some local snapshot for you that I was looking at and thinking about. And in addition, we've got our first ever video, which is just 3.5 minutes, and you can check it out on our website, and I'll show you the link in a minute. This is our mission: advocating for walkable, bikeable, inclusive, and transit-oriented communities as the most sustainable and equitable way for the Washington, D.C. region to grow and provide opportunities for all. One of our preceding groups in 1996 issued a report called A Network of Livable Communities, using metro, commuter rail, bus network, showing that these walkable transit-oriented communities would actually reduce traffic in the Washington, D.C. region. Some people listened to us, not everybody did. I feel like I'm coming from the future that you don't want, Northern Virginia. Maybe some of you came from there, and I'm deeply worried. One of the themes here is that mistakes are being repeated down here in this particular region. Let me pause real quickly. How many people in the crowd live in Fredericksburg? Pretty big majority. How many live in Spotsylvania? A few? Stafford. All right. Caroline. King George. Okay. I just want to get some sense of everybody, where you're all from. So there's only a few people who get upset, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. So our blueprint, really, we started thinking about it. The pandemic had everybody suddenly fearful of each other, spreading out, separating. I felt like it was reigniting people moving away from each other. We also get pretty disconnected when we're on Zoom all the time, but I think people really like to be together. I certainly am enjoying seeing and meeting everybody here today. So public spaces, great places to be is a big part of it. Different types of neighborhoods, different types of choices in housing and transportation are a key part of a thriving community. But unfortunately, a lot of what we do is spend our time in cars, and so traffic, very large arterials that are dangerous to walk on, as Scudder's talked about, and even traffic jams at school. So when our children can't safely walk and bike to school because of the roads we've designed, mom and dad had to drive them, and now we have traffic jams at schools, and the kids are less healthy. Mixed in with the challenges we're facing is our housing affordability challenge. The yellow are the single-family detached zones within the Washington, D.C. region. The young Yes in My Backyard folks have talked a lot about that challenge that's created by not having enough housing options. And the pressures on you all down here, as many may have moved here for more affordability in homes, is that a lack of affordable homes close into DC and its wealth of jobs and so forth leads to longer commutes and that sort of traffic like you see on the Beltway. In our blueprint, we also talk about, relative to what Scudder was saying, a clustered, walkable place. You're going to drive a lot less in the upper left than you will in a place that's more spread out. But in moving farther out, there are challenges. We're talking about housing affordability today. I've not heard enough about the combined housing plus transportation cost calculation. And in fact, when I asked Henrico County about their new housing investment fund, turns out they are not investing based upon location efficiency, based upon access to transit and jobs in their housing investments. So you move out to Loudoun County and buy a house compared to buying in Arlington, your transportation costs are going to be that much higher, and you might end up paying more. And you're not allowed to deduct your transportation costs. And the more we spend on transportation, the less we're saving for our kids' college. The other challenge we've got, of course, is we built a world with rarely unsafe streets, very dangerous places to cross on many of these arterials, and is disproportionately affecting people of lower incomes and people people of color. All contributing, the amount we're driving transportation is our #1 source of emissions today. We've gotten our energy sector a lot cleaner, our homes are more efficient, but transportation is our #1 source. That is a real picture on a Coalition for Smart Growth walking tour in Old Town Alexandria. They're having more recurrent flooding all the time, and we thought it was really appropriate that there was also a bike park there. I think it's an electric bike, it is. So we're trying to solve the problem, but it's catching up with us. And we're clearing a lot of land for roads and more growth in forested areas, and we need those forests for carbon sinks. It's interesting, you often think about energy uses. There's a lot of people in cities, therefore they must have more carbon emissions. But when you look at driving and how much your emissions are, much lower per capita emissions if you live in a walkable community. So that can really help. So we think there's a better way. Where and how we grow matters, how we design our communities matter, and it starts with land use, which you just heard from Scudder, and I'm going to show you some additional illustrations of that, of separated land use here and how much that contributes to our driving. So we broke our vision into 3 pillars now: inclusive, vibrant communities, housing for all, and sustainable transportation. Old Town Alexandria and the closed off lower part of King Street, tying these places together with our metro network and walkable transit-oriented communities tied to our metro system, medium density, among others, being shown here, and the great story of high density in Arlington's Roslyn, Ballston, and Crystal City corridors. But it's also about small towns and how these can be bikeable, walkable, transit accessible, and how we transform commercial corridors like the one above into something with medium density development. And all of this makes a major contribution to also being able to conserve the rural lands we love so much that we want to keep nearby. This happens in Sugarloaf in Montgomery County. Montgomery made very clear choices about focusing development in near its metro stations and preserving a 90,000-acre agricultural reserve. So, thriving communities, great places we want to be, preserving rural spaces in the process, but making housing a top priority. These are garden apartments and affordable garden apartments in Alexandria. There's a mix of different types of housing available, everything from what you see in the RV corridor, Roslyn Ballston corridor on the upper left, to a duplex in the middle, to what looks like a 6 or an 8-plex here on the right, and some medium density and some townhouses, the missing middle housing. Even accessory dwelling units, whether it's the backyard carriage house, or the lower right, it's hard to see, but tucked back in there with some of the same roof lines is a small accessory dwelling unit as well. And need housing over retail as well on a medium density scale. All of these things are possible tools and types of choices we can make available to people. And very specific affordable housing approaches and commitments and projects. Upper left is replaced public housing in Alexandria, 1930s, 1940s public housing that was really terrible shape. And there's been one-for-one replacement of affordable housing, not all on site, but at least a third of the units in this development and of townhouses in Old Town are affordable. A fully affordable building on the right, made possible by the sale of the adjacent parcel for like $12 million for a market rate building. Lower left are 60 affordable units on top of a fire station using public land. And on the right, lower right, are affordable garden apartments that are committed affordable. And we tie it to sustainable transportation. Yes, I know you don't have a metro system, but you do have VRE as one option. But we can do great things with bus as well. But to go back to what Scudder says, we have, every day you see a Twitter picture of that frequency on our metro system. Frequency is freedom. People are flocking back to metro, because when you only have to wait 5 or 6 minutes for a train, it is phenomenal, and you really feel the difference. But it is also about the bus. Scudder's work in Richmond and Alexandria had been just transformative for the bus service in both of those places, providing much more frequent service and really bumping up ridership. Both of them are, kind of leading the nation in growth in bus ridership. And we can do fancier things like bus rapid transit, the Metro Way, It's a terrific service in Alexandria and Arlington on its own dedicated lanes. And let's not forget, walking and biking. Our kids who can walk safely to school. How about all that bike parking in Falls Church next to that school in the upper right? Obviously great trails and roads that are safe enough with enough protected bike infrastructure that you feel good riding with your kids. And here's some other examples of safe walking and biking infrastructure. But we also have to really say the hard thing, which is for some people, which is stop expanding the roads. Scudder talked about induced demand. They can widen I-95 all they want, and in fact, VDOT, to its credit, studied widening I-95 with a general purpose lane all the way to Richmond from DC for $12 billion, and it made zero difference. That's why they're spending so much investing in the rail corridor. I'm going to dig in a little deeper on this where and how we grow thing and why it's important. It's especially important for the newer parts of Fredericksburg, out Route 3, and Spotsylvania and Stafford, and our suburbs in general. This is what we call our Where's the Center in Centerville slide, because this is Centerville. And it's got all the aspects of a village, but they're all separated. You can't get there from here. You're not going to walk. You have one or two large arterials like Scudder talked about. Got churches, shopping, homes, offices, all there, all disconnected. It's like one of those fancy restaurants where they deconstruct the food and the meal, right? They never taste that great, right? Well, this doesn't work so well either. And this becomes your daily life. You know, mom and dad, driving everywhere for everything, and it's very difficult. It means you need tons of acres for parking for all those stops you're going to make. It means the place is unwalkable. And here's a great illustration. I don't know if this is not working. I think I didn't get the animation going. But to go back to what Scudder was saying about connectivity and the transportation situation, this is your classic commercial strip with commercial, traditional development where everything's separated, schools, shops, a park, and work, and those T's are all the left-hand turning movements mom or dad would make trying to stop at all those places in the afternoon after school. But if you put them all on one side with the grid of streets, you're only making 2 left turns on that road, or actually 1 left turn and 1 right turn at the end of the day. It's a Park 1's district, and you use half the parking, half the land area, 1/4 of the arterial trips, 1/6 the arterial turning movements, and 1/4 the amount of miles driven. So you can park once, kid can walk to school and to after school recreation on their own, you can walk to work and do some shopping, and you can all meet up and go. Simplified version from Jeff Tomlin and Nelson Nygaard years ago, but I think it's very helpful. And then you could add transit to it, and now you're not even taking any car trip at all. Here's another way to illustrate what Scudder was talking about in terms of our disconnected suburbs on the upper right versus connected. This is from Andre Strwani and Dwayne Potter-Zyber architects. Upper right, everything's separated. Lower left, you're on a grid, you can walk to things. And this is an illustration on the upper right. All your trips end up on the arterial. Think Route 3, Route 17. You're stuck on that arterial behind those 3-minute light cycles and so forth because you can't connect otherwise. Whereas all the other trips in the lower left with the connected community do not have to be on the arterial. Years ago, our Albemarle County Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission did a Places 29 plan, Route 29, to create a connected grid just like I've been showing. And think about it from the kid's perspective. On the left, living on the cul-de-sac, Scudder talked about the importance of having bike trails or paths to connect between cul-de-sacs. Because otherwise, if you want your child to walk to school, that's what it's going to take on the left versus on the right with a connected community. It'd be a lot easier. So turning to this region, and apologies ahead of time to anyone from Carolina and King George. I wasn't able to look at your conference plans very quickly, and I'm just giving a couple of snapshot impressions. I looked at the length of those comprehensive plans. They are impressive. And there's lots of great work that's been done. Fredericksburg, Spotsy, Stafford, lots of great detail and data that went into all of them, and ongoing studies. But let's look at a couple of things. First of all, I think this came from the Fredericksburg folks, looking at using Weldon Cooper's data on growth, and the upper part are the regional, the county projections for Spotsylvania and Stafford, and on the lower part are the 2 rural counties plus Fredericksburg. And it's stunning to me to see such little growth in Fredericksburg as compared to the outer suburbs. And then when I looked at this chart and looked at the math, There's something like 186,000 more people between 2020 and 2050 that would arrive in this region or be born in this region, live here, and over that period of time, only like 11,000 projected for Fredericksburg. That to me is disastrous in terms of the level of traffic you will see in the future. If you sprawl outward and people cannot live closer in and walkable neighborhoods where you can have transit in the future, access to jobs and so forth, closer to the VRE, that's a challenge for the future, and that becomes as bad, if not worse, than Northern Virginia's situation. And I looked at some of the populations from growth from the projections in the comp plan for Spotsylvania, a 2.8% growth rate in 2020. I mean, Virginia and the nation are growing at less than 1% a year. So that means you're getting more than your fair share in terms of a growth rate, and that's going to be a huge pressure to try to keep up with that. Great study on affordability that was talked about in the larger sessions. I just am very impressed about the work that all of you have been doing on housing affordability. These were some of the top takeaways I saw in there about all the cost burdens. You've heard about it all day, so I will not repeat it, but you collected all the data about the challenge and the problem. I did look at the service areas, here's Stafford, comp plan growth areas and conservation areas. Note, of course, in the green, I didn't look specifically at what your zoning is within those green agricultural areas, but often it can be some places as little as one house per acre. Some places one house per 3, one per 5, it depends on the county. That's kind of challenging to keep agricultural when you do that. I suspect, but these growth areas are more than enough to accommodate even that significant population growth that's talked about if we were to do it in a walkable type environment. That you would not have to expand these in any way at all. I do like that there's consideration of how to retrofit street grids and create centers in places like Stafford and Courthouse. And I also like that there's, and I guess this does exist, that the Stafford uses transfer development rights. We created the Whitewater and Crow's Nest, but transfer development rights is a great tool, not as good in Virginia as it is in Maryland the way it's set up, but bringing that growth into the growth areas and maybe using it to provide extra density bonuses and affordable housing would be helpful. But these are also great environmental tourism assets that you have. Spotsylvania, another growth boundary, primary development boundary set up. A comp plan proposal, but it's got that little surprise at Lake Anna. Maybe someone can tell me about that later. That little leapfrog, massive commercial mixed-use center down at Lake Anna. I don't know how you end up serving that, and I think trying to serve it would mean you'd fill everything else in between. I looked at a couple other snapshots of things. When this tourism visitation in Spotsylvania, 92% of the tourists were at battlefields and state parks. The rest were museums and breweries, distilleries, vineyards, etc. Shows you the value of open space and parkland and battlefields. It's something not to forget as you grow. When I came to the University of Virginia from up north, you can tell my accent's not from Virginia or farther south, it was the beauty of this state that got me there. I mean, I was sold. I could have gone farther, but I said, no, this is it. And a lot of it was because back then you turned on to I-66 and it was 2 lanes in each direction with trees in the middle. Now it looks like the New Jersey Turnpike. But, and then you saw the mountains and you continued down 29. Do not underestimate how important rural beauty and green space and view sheds are to your future economic competitiveness. If we start looking like everywhere USA, people stop coming here, they'll go to the next place. I looked at housing inventory too for Spotsylvania in the comp plan, and I asked, are there enough multifamily attached townhouses in those plans? Again, which would also allow for more compact, walkable development. And there was a great study, it looks like it was done a while back when we created the urban development area legislation in Virginia, to see how much, this was a great study of how much land you would need for single family at 4 dwelling units an acre, townhouses at 6, and multifamily at 12. And you start to see you don't need that many acres. And these are actually relatively low densities for those categories. And as you go to all multifamily, you're only using 1,455 acres compared to doing just single family, you'd use basically twice that number of acres. So there are ways we can save land through creating compact, walkable, very desirable communities and preserve the things we really love about the community. So my key takeaways are link housing to walkable mixed-use neighborhoods and transit, increase housing development within the city of Fredericksburg, strengthen your land conservation and zoning tools to protect agriculture, forest, water supplies, and tourism, reduce your land consumption overall in your future plans, and create these connected local street grids instead of continuously widening arterials. So we have a choice. This region has a choice, just like every region, in which path we'll take in terms of where and how we grow. And we hope that you'll choose the one that Scudder and I have been talking about today. There we go. Thank you. And I'll give you, I think that was it. Okay. I'll let tech handle this. Looks like we have a solar eclipse. All right, questions? I know it's after lunch.
Hi. So with the linear model, how does that differ for school bus transportation? How many stops, how long it takes, how many bus drivers are needed?
In which model? I'm sorry.
Linear versus
Oh.
the.
Well, under any better connected street network model, you will typically have fewer vehicle miles traveled for all kinds of trips. I will just add a note about school bus transportation. School bus transportation is a very specialized condition, and general public transit only really serves a lot of school children in very dense places like DC, New York, Philadelphia, because it's so widespread, so frequent, and so ubiquitous that it's there and easy for 80 to 90% of school children. A lot of places like Arlington, even where I live, which has a lot of transit, you still need a lot of school buses. But they tend to be able to get places more easily when you have a connected street grid.
I think I would add, I think we've seen it recently in many counties, the cost of school busing has become exorbitant. I mean, it's a significant cost to jurisdictions. And if you create a place where your children cannot walk or bike to school, even those who live within a mile of school, you're significantly increasing your school transportation costs. And at a time when you can't find enough drivers for many services, that's become a big problem. Jeff Speck, who wrote Walkable City, has done some work on this, and has other urbanists as well, that when you're all spread out and you have cul-de-sacs, you have higher police and fire, emergency services costs as well. You need more stations to serve those places because they can't get within their response times for fire departments. You can't get there fast enough. So you need to sprinkle more fire stations out there as compared to a gridded city. So there's all sorts of inefficiencies created from the cul-de-sac disconnected model.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. I'm with the Disability Resource Center, and so we represent people that are transit dependent. So somewhere around 28 years ago, when we had public transit start, we celebrated because all of the buses had lifts. What we didn't celebrate was the lack of access if you were further than 3/4 of a mile from the route. And so sometimes that's, out in the county, but sometimes it's really not that far out, but the person's not able to get to the bus stop. And so I don't know what I love your future plans, but like right now, we haven't seen a lot of change in the 28 years for these people that are transit dependent. And so that means they can't get jobs. Oftentimes they can't get to health care or other services.
So you're talking about the accessibility by sidewalk and street crossings, safe street crossings, just to get to the service, the transit service.
That and also, when you get out to the county, there's not going to be sidewalks. So
Right.
And there's no routes out that far anyway. So
It is absolutely terrible how much we're not investing in our older cities and towns and their aging infrastructure and repairing what they've already got, or completing their networks of sidewalks and making crossings safer. And the fact is that we've been doing development on the cheap in the outer areas where we're not, for many years didn't require sidewalks. I think they're more often requiring them now, but usually they're just on the frontage of that one development, and they don't have to put it in anymore. We are rolling in billions of dollars of transportation money, and even more so since the bipartisan infrastructure law. But the state departments of transportation only seem to love the big roads in many cases, and not all of the state departments of transportation are this way. There are some specialized funds for sidewalks and bike lanes and things like that, but they're a drop in the bucket compared to the billions that go into road expansion. We're trying to get a fix-it-first approach. Maintain and repair what you've already built, retrofit your roads that you don't have sidewalks, do that, invest in transit, but we can't afford to do all that road expansion and make what we've already built work otherwise. You've got some thoughts probably on transit.
Yeah, I think one of the things you mentioned, for maybe not everyone is familiar with, you mentioned the service within 3/4 of a mile, which you assume you're referring to the paratransit service.
There's no paratransit service. That's available to anyone.
Oh,
Deviation is available.
deviated fixed route. Okay.
There's no paratransit.
Okay, right. So, just making sure I understood what you were referring to. So, for those who aren't deep in the weeds, yes, you have in your system in a lot of cases deviations from the main fixed route that can be made in order to get people to their front door, particularly those who may have a mobility issue. In a lot of other communities that have pure fixed route services, meaning the bus doesn't ever deviate from its fixed path, you have an overlaid service called paratransit, which is a door-to-door, like metro accesses in the DC region, for people who have a disability that prevents them from getting to the actual bus stop. The challenge we face in transit is the obligation to provide that service in a lot of communities comes with where you run the fixed route service. And it's a relatively costly, not really an add-on, it's a very important feature, but it is a relatively costly service compared to the traditional fixed route. But you're definitely, a lot of communities experience this problem of people are aging in place, and those places are not very walkable. Those places are very hard for transit to serve efficiently. And how we're facing potentially very high transportation costs to provide folks the service they might need to access their daily needs. And yes, there's not a really immediate short-term answer to that other than better and more service, which can cost a good deal of investment from local communities. But it's also an important part of the larger state and federal conversation about how we're funding all of these services and how much we're putting into building and expanding roads versus maintaining what we have and providing services to the places that exist now. There was a question up front here.
Yeah. Are there models nationwide, right, for cities like Fredericksburg, right, building out transit networks as the city expands, as the region expands and grows? Is it an inward, figuring out how to get people in or out or looping around? I mean, is there best practices out there, right, as we look to build out a transit network, right? Is it just bus? Is it bus and bike? Should we focus on one multi-layered question? Who else is doing it right with our scale?
So I think you can look to a lot of other, mid-sized and smaller cities. A lot of university towns are doing this very well, in part because they have large university partners who are willing to spend. So, Chapel Hill in North Carolina has a very robust, substantial transit service, a significant investment in bikeability and walkability. I think of Boulder, Colorado, for example. And fundamentally, a shared trait you see in most of those communities is one, a substantial investment in the frequency of service, getting to 30 minutes and 20 minutes and on most routes or better. In terms of whether, how do you build the structure of that network? It depends a little bit on your individual geography, but the basic reality of most communities is the most effective services for most people are things that bring you to a dense core, so to a downtown as the starting point. And then you start to build a network. You look at the Richmond network that is starting to emerge as it grows, and it is very radially oriented towards downtown because that's where a lot of activity is. But now that you've got significant investment in frequency on a lot of those north, south, east, west corridors into downtown, you're starting to see a spider web of a network being built with more orbital style routes. But those only start to really make sense once you have the higher frequency on the things that are serving really dense places in a radial pattern first. Now, again, that's general overall structure, and it'll vary a little bit from place to place.
Great presentation, thank you. I liked your example about the cul-de-sac, and I want to get into that a little bit. A combination of emergency services can be a curse and a blessing on these things. And with new developments, you might get by with smaller roads, smaller cul-de-sacs, if you can provide that cut through with bollards, that is emergency services only. So that works well sometimes. But for developments where that wasn't in place, have you seen any examples where jurisdictions have been able to acquire land or easements, at least, for those kinds of cut-throughs under the sometimes more palatable guise of emergency services, but creating more access?
I'm not aware of any. I do know in Fairfax they have done a couple of cases where they've actually connected trails through. Even that was a huge fight. It helps to have more positive homeowners who want their kids to be able to walk to school or see their friends a little more easily, but it's very hard to retrofit afterward, and it's expensive. I don't think they'll prove worthwhile. You have to buy 2 houses to get an emergency service cut through. I think from the beginning we need to do more connected street networks and have counties insist on that from the developers and set the rules of the game right. Years ago, 2007, we got subdivision street connectivity passed. It was an idea from Jeff Speck of Walkable City, and we got the legislation in, we got the regs written, and in the next 5 or 6 years, the industry kept coming back and getting those standard connectivity standards weakened. They are still on the books, but it was supposed to be that you didn't just have one entrance and exit onto that arterial. Because what's been happening is, understand the quiet, desire for a quiet cul-de-sac and all that, but the result is the cost and the burden of traffic is put on the taxpayers for the arterial. And then VDOT does its best to keep widening the arterial for all these cul-de-sac communities connecting to the one arterial. And then they run out of that. That doesn't work anymore. They have to put in $200 million interchanges, or $150 million interchanges. And that then further divides the community and makes it less desirable in general. So it would help to start from the very beginning and have more connected neighborhoods and more connected to each other as these suburban communities build out.
Any other questions? I think the one thing I can say, I think I know of one example where they built an emergency access into the Stony Point Mall in Richmond, off of a cul-de-sac from Side Street. And it does provide pedestrian access to a fairly low-density residential neighborhood nearby. But that, I think, was also a fight in and of itself. So again, you want to try to do this from the start as much as you can.
So my question would be, so we're with transit, so if you all want to poo-poo on transit, it's okay, we're here, we're not. So Fredericksburg the Fredericksburg region is not a very pro-transit region. And that's just because how we're structured. Downtown Fredericksburg is is growing. So you've got the density there, but Stafford and Spotsylvania don't really have that. So our transit network is a little bit rinky-dink, as I describe it. So putting some of those things that you're saying in place are hard because they're all retrofits. So how do you explain the value in, this is almost like Chesterfield in Richmond, trying to explain the value of transit in Chesterfield when they didn't want it. So how do you use some of your knowledge from cities up north in the Richmond area to help with the forward thinking of what this network is going to look like? So Scudder, you already said, hey, where are you going to place these people? There's no more capacity for your roads, but what would be, I mean, the elephant and the wine glass are one item, but just, are there any other helpful hints or perspectives that you could help us with as a region, for the planners in the room, for the elected officials in the room, to let them know the value of transit, because we have to do something, because there's no space left in Fredericksburg region, so. Sorry for the long question, but you can figure out the answer.
You were facing an enormous challenge in running the transit agency for this region, because yeah, from what I can tell, there's not enormous support for transit investment right now, from what I've heard. And the challenge for any transit agency that wants to be really useful to a lot of people is it needs to be as frequent as it can, and you can't do that unless you have the operating investment year in and year out to run the service. I'm glad you mentioned Chesterfield, because 15 years ago, I would never have imagined Chesterfield welcoming transit expansion. For those of you who are not familiar with the Richmond region, GRTC used to be technically a private entity. It still technically is a private nonprofit that's managed by its owners. But the owners of GRTC were the city of Richmond and Chesterfield County. The only reason Chesterfield County was part owner was so that they could be on the board and make sure no transit came into Chesterfield County. Right. Yeah.
And then Henrico didn't want to pay for it, so they
And
joined.
Henrico didn't want to pay for it, so they joined.
their own technique.
They did provide some funding but they provided some funding for a little bit of service. But neither were extremely interested in investing for a long, long time. And that has started to change in part because just this geometric reality and kind of hitting them over the head with it for years and years. I think the freedom story has helped them recognize the value of how transit can connect the people in their communities who are struggling to jobs, but also it's become a big factor in the last 4 or 5 years as the labor shortages in a lot of those communities have created challenges of getting people to the jobs in the suburban jurisdictions, because there's just such an enormous fight for labor in a lot of communities today. In some cases, I mean, ultimately, what will sell the value of transit depends a little bit on what is it each community wants. But another piece of the puzzle can be the story of what is it going to do for your aging population. That is a bit of the story, I think, of why Chesterfield has been much more interested in transit. So there's a lot of different angles you can come at this from to try to help get more people to buy in. Part of the story of what has created success in Richmond was that the city started with the process of rethinking its route structure and redesigning its route network and adding some investment and spearheading doing this BRT corridor on Broad Street. That sort of coalesced into a lot more belief that the transit system could do more. And that really started just with the city itself. And that's a kind of thing we've seen in a lot of communities from big to small across the country, is when the core city of the region takes much more interest in investing and making transit more useful in all sorts of ways. Because deciding to rebuild Broad Street was an enormous fight. You're probably not going to be building that kind of BRT in this community, but there's all sorts of other decisions that the city of Fredericksburg could do to take leadership on making transit more effective and more efficient. Jamie, in the transit agency can't do that much because so much of the physical infrastructure decisions have got to be done and led by the city or the county if it's in the county, but the city is at the core and at the start. So that's why I always encourage regions like this. It's almost impossible to fix the problem regionally from the start. So start where you can. And the core city is the most effective place to start in trying to really make transit more useful for your community.
I'd like to add that the advocacy community can play a huge role. Reverend Ben Campbell, who operated ran Richmond Hill, which is an ecumenical retreat center, brought together faith leaders from all denominations, all faiths, rabbis, imams, everybody together, and made the case for better transit in Richmond. He showed isochrones is how far you could reach. First, he showed how many jobs people in the city could not reach, and how many more they could reach if we improved our transit system. He created a transit map of his own of what a future transit network could be for the area, and that moral authority played a big role in sparking all of this. And then he founded RVA Rapid Transit. We have our Partnership for Smarter Growth group there. The two groups work together. We actually really had to push the city council, believe it or not, at the time, Scudder knows. And because of our relationships with the state officials at that time, we actually ended up having Governor McCall as Secretary of Transportation, his head of rail and public transit, and the Deputy Secretary of Transportation all have to testify before City Council to tell them to take their money. So if you have a helpful state administration that's got some money, they can help you pull this off too. But it really helps to have the local leadership and the local advocacy groups, both religious and non-religious, all engaged in advocating for its benefits. And I still remember it was a day like when the sun suddenly comes out and shines when the Pulse opened. It was like a big holiday in the city. You've never seen so many people riding the bus, and some who had never ridden the bus in their lives. And they discovered how amazing frequent bus service was. And the deal was, though, we didn't just want to create one bus that went through the really great bus system line that went through the middle of the city without taking care of the rest of the city. And that's where they brought Scudder in, to plan the whole network and create those other every 15-minute routes and make it all work well together. And that's why Richmond's done so well. And I think the county's got jealous. I think they've gotten jealous that young people were coming to the city, that the city was revitalizing. People were loving the transit and the biking. And I think the counties started to worry they were about to get out-competed. That's why in Henrico you're starting to see these mixed-use developments, expanding, funding to expand transit and so forth. And I think that made a difference as well. So Fredericksburg, make the counties jealous.
They're doing a good job, and the counties are the ones we need to actually get on board. So.
Yeah, but they did. Chesterfield did come on board. I mean, I thought when I moved to Richmond, I found out that Chesterfield was on the board of GRTC specifically so they could prevent bus service from coming to their county, which is a legacy of white flight and racism. But they didn't want it to come there, and now they're finally coming along. But I think it did take a lot of the moral authority of the religious community played a role, and access to jobs and talent, and it's making a difference. Chesterfield still has a lot to do on its revitalization areas, though, to invest in.
And they just celebrated last year a big expansion in one of the core routes out to their biggest mall. So, yeah, I'm like you. I moved to Richmond not as long as you did, but I did there for a while, and I've been pretty amazed at the transition. We have another question.
Yes. You mentioned earlier about I forgot Stony something you said.
Oh, Stony Point in response to the emergency access question. Yeah.
And, you said it was a fight. What was the component in that fight that they won? How was the fight won? How was the battle over?
Oh, I don't know for sure. All I know is that there was a need for emergency back access. For those of you who don't know the geography, Stony Point Mall is this mall that's built off of a little sort of weird expressway orbital road, Chettenham Parkway, in a little island of the city that's right next to Chesterfield County in the far southwest of the city.
The whole thing is a cul-de-sac.
The whole thing is a cul-de-sac. The entire, there's medical offices, there's shopping centers, it is the entire opposite of everything we've been talking about. But in order to meet some basic access needs for emergency access, you couldn't just have the singular point be the freeway interchange. You had to have something on the backside of the development, and the backside of the development was next to these fairly old, fairly wealthy, near the river suburbs that had been built in 1970. And so the fight was that emergency access road to get to those cul-de-sac streets so that fire or police or whatnot could have a back way to get into the property. But it's also, the neighbors didn't want any access because they didn't want this mall anywhere near them. So the fight was fighting that in order to stop the mall in part, but also just, they were worried that it might eventually become a public street. It's never become a public open street. It's still just emergency access. It's also effectively pedestrian and bike access as well. That's, you see those kinds of fights all the time when you try to retrofit some kind of pedestrian access through a cul-de-sac because someone has bought there and believes that this is my private road at that point, and that no one else should be able to come through here. When in reality, what we've done is we've socialized the cost of their private
their private road, what they think is their private road, even if it is a public street.
And how would you transfer this ideal to rural areas? Because there was a time when 610 was a two-way lane. I mean, so look at it now. So eventually, these areas that look like farmlands probably gonna be looking like Fairfax, 20 years from now. So, I mean.
Doesn't have to. I think you got enough land paved over already. Don't have to keep marching out west or down to the Potomac. Honestly, I mean, why repeat the mistakes in Northern Virginia and have to sit in all that traffic? And then, then of course they come back begging for an outer connector highway to connect the two counties upriver across what is one of your most amazing assets for quality of life, the Rappahannock River. Your drinking water supply, a great draw for tourism and beauty and nature. I mean, there's so much more we can do. Sorry, Stafford, I'm going to single out Geico, which I know is a big employer. Why the heck was Geico put, all those years ago, put that far out? Or why is University of Mary Washington Hospital putting its clinic that far out? I have a little conspiracy theory. I'm never going to be invited back to this region. But it's happened elsewhere too. I believe that a lot of either a large employer in that case, or let's say a public facility like a hospital, have been leapfrogging outward because the public then pays for the water and sewer trunk line connections. And the home builders then come back and say, hey, that's great, thank you very much for that water and sewer trunk line. I don't have to pay for that now. I'm going to connect into it with my new development. So, the Harrisonburg Hospital was taken out of Harrisonburg and put out on the other side of I-81. I mean, I just keep seeing these things pop out when a hospital ought to be really in the mix of uses of office and retail and people living there and all that on a grid of streets, and not an isolated facility, that results in an extended water and sewer line that people then tap into. I mean, the bill just gets passed on. There's a group called Strong Towns that calls it a Ponzi scheme. And the bill starts coming due. And we really cannot afford to keep expanding outward and repair what we've already built, the older infrastructure in the city of Fredericksburg, for instance, or the older neighborhoods in Stafford or Spotsylvania. We're out of money. Our entire infrastructure bill was borrowed money, pretty much, because the gas tax is not paying for all of it. And so we can't keep. I'm a fiscal conservative environmentalist, because we have to think about where and how we grow and grow more efficiently. And these are great places. That's what our blueprint's about. We want to be together. We want to see each other. We don't, just want to doom scroll, I don't think, right? That's why breweries are so popular and so forth. Fredericksburg is this great, wonderful core that this region has. Gracefully infill at the right scales. And then on the edges where it starts to get more suburban, you can do a lot more. Create these walkable, connected neighborhoods there. Do the same with the older, already built up areas in Stafford and Spotsy. And then save these amazing resources you have. In terms of these creeks that flow into the Potomac, the historic battlefields, and just, your drinking water supplies, your farms. You can do it. And if you want to have a more successful economy in the future and not just just go along, that's what make you stand out and then make the quality of life better for everybody. But if it keeps doing suburban cul-de-sacs, all the traffic on 17 and 3 and 610, people are just going to forget it. I'm out of here. Go to the next place. And then the same thing might happen. I often say the safest